Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those who are joining us. Thank you for joining our number 5 webinar in this series called Publishing Best Practices. My name is Nargiza Ludgate. This series are presented by the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems at the University of Florida and the University of Florida Libraries. Today's webinar is about being expansive, sharing my work in ways I may not have considered. In this session, we will discuss about the importance of sharing your research results, which can be done in traditional ways, such as through presentations at the scientific or research conferences, or publishing in a peer-reviewed journal. But we will also share with you some practices on other ways of publishing your research results. Next slide, please. I will now introduce our speaker. Dr. Terry Ketz-Self is an experienced clinical investigator with specific expertise in the planning and execution of clinical trials involving mind-body therapies for chronic conditions related to aging and stress. She received a Doctor of Chiropractic degree from Palmer College of Chiropractic and a PhD in Educational Research from the University of Virginia. She also completed an NIH-funded postdoctoral fellowship in clinical research at the University of Virginia Center for the Study of Complementary and Alternative Therapies. Dr. Self's research background serves her well in her current position as a translational research and impact librarian at the University of Florida. Before we start, let me share a few housekeeping points, which I will also drop in the chat. This webinar will go for about an hour. Please keep your microphones mute during the presentation. You are welcome to write your name, institution you are from, and your email in the chat. The recording of these and other webinars in this series will be soon available in the Livestock Labs website, and I will post the link in the chat. I will shortly drop the PowerPoint slides in French for the webinar in the chat box, so you can follow this presentation in French. At the very end of the presentation, we will have a short question and answer session. Therefore, if you have questions or comments you would like to make, please add them in the chat. We will address those at the very end. Now I will give Dr. Self a floor to continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Nargiza. So in today's session, we're going to discuss why it's important to share your findings, some common methods of disseminating the results, and some additional article types for sharing content you may not have considered sharing previously. So we are going to get right into it. Let's start with why it's important to spread the word about your research. The most obvious reason is that others need to hear about it if it's going to have any impact. And this is not limited only to reporting on studies with statistically significant findings. It's also important to share negative findings so that others can learn what doesn't work as well as what does. Researchers can build on what has worked and avoid wasting time and other resources pursuing avenues that have been found to be unproductive. Another reason it's important is that funding agencies typically expect researchers to share their results. I know some grant applications require a dissemination plan that addresses how you would go about disseminating the findings, and they allow you to budget for conference travel or publication costs. The last reason I'll mention is for those at academic institutions where the number of publications you've authored and the number of citations they have received are often a consideration for promotion and tenure. That's commonly referred to here as publish or perish. If we have time during the Q&A, I would love to hear if that's a common expectation where you are. So having provided some reasons for the importance of reporting on your research, we'll now look at some ways to go about that. In the sciences, one of the common methods of sharing findings is to present at a conference. Sometimes it's a poster that you display, other times it might be an oral presentation. Another way to disseminate information on your research is to publish in scholarly journals. There are a variety of different article types, including the standard original research articles that most people are already familiar with. But there are some other forms such as brief reports, study protocols, and literature reviews. And we're going to look more closely at each of these. And we will start with conference presentations. This is often the first place that researchers share their findings. Actually, many conferences will not allow presentations on research that has already been published in a journal. So if you're interested in sharing your work at a conference, it's most likely going to be your most recent work that you have not published on yet. Choosing a conference to present at has some similarities to choosing a journal in which to publish. You want to look at the conference website to see if the scope of the topics to be covered matches your research. Check their call for abstracts to see what instructions they give relative to the abstracts. They'll often provide an abstract template, and some also provide a scoring rubric that will give you a better idea of what they're looking for as you're putting your abstract together. Accepted abstracts are often published in a supplemental issue of a recognized journal in the field. I suggest you consider using the same authorship criteria you would apply to an article you were going to publish when you were naming co-authors on your presentation. This is particularly important if you're planning to subsequently publish a journal article covering the same content. Journals sometimes require that all of the authors that were named on the abstract of a conference presentation be included as authors on the journal article as well. Or they require you to provide an explanation for why anyone was excluded. Conference presentations are typically considered lower impact than journal articles. That said, I can personally vouch for the fact that presentations, even at small conferences, can lead to future opportunities. I presented a poster at a small conference, this was years ago, reporting the results of just a single arm, small pilot study that we had conducted. That poster came to the attention of someone who was on the board of an organization that was interested in funding a larger controlled study similar to the one we had piloted. They contacted us and we ended up with a grant. Now, I won't go so far as to say it was solely due to the conference presentation, but it certainly played a role. And while presenting at a conference can help you become known by others in the field, you do need to choose wisely. Unfortunately, not all conferences are reputable. Some are considered predatory. So along with predatory journals, you also need to be on the lookout for predatory conferences. Think, Check, Attend is a resource that can help you in choosing trusted conferences. It's like Think, Check, Submit that we looked at in our last session, but this one is for conferences instead of journals. Like Think, Check, Submit, they have a checklist of items to assess. Here I've highlighted some of the items. First off, does the scope of the conference meet your needs? And if not, you could stop right there. If it does, is it a conference you or your colleagues have attended before? Are you familiar with the association that is organizing the conference? Have you read any papers from the conference in the past? Check the conference website to see whether information is presented clearly. Are required fees clearly stated? Do they discuss the peer review process for abstracts? Do you recognize the names of committee members? Have you heard of keynote speakers? Where will proceedings be published and indexed? Attending conferences can be expensive and time consuming. So taking the time to identify conferences that will reach your intended audience and are reputable is worth the time it takes to go through this assessment. So I recommend considering the conference presentation just the first step in disseminating the information, and that anytime you present at a conference, you go on from there and turn that content into a journal article if possible. Peer-reviewed journal articles are the gold standard in the sciences. There are a number of different types of articles that can be published, and we're going to look at a few. I am assuming everyone's already familiar with the standard original research article, but we will look more closely at the brief form of that, as well as study protocols and literature reviews. So original research articles are part of the type you're most familiar with. It's probably the type of article you have in mind if you're looking to publish the findings of a study which involved primary data collection. These are the articles that present new knowledge, data, or information. In the previous series that we did, we talked quite a bit about the standard original research article. Our focus today is on the types of articles you have probably not considered in the past. So I want to draw your attention to brief reports, sometimes known as short communications. These are original research articles, but they're shorter, as the name implies. In this example from Livestock Science, you can see they limit them to no more than 5 journal pages, while they allow up to 12 pages for the standard size article. If you have a limited study that has some interesting findings, but doesn't really seem to warrant a full article, you might consider submitting it as a brief report. Another type of article is a study protocol. These articles are published before the study is conducted, and they detail the methods as planned. As such, this type of article promotes transparency. And due to the fact that the focus of the article is on the methods, they allow for a great degree of detail to be included, which promotes reproducibility. I find that many people are unaware that this article type even exists. And I think that's in part because they're not published by all journals. If you're interested in publishing a study protocol, search a database to find journals that publish them in your subject area. And here I've provided an example of how to do that. I've just used the Dimensions database, which is a freely available database. I just searched on the topic livestock and the phrase study protocol. And you can see in the results from that search, many of them have study protocol in the title. So this is a study protocol as the subtitle, study protocol. So it's a good way to identify some study protocols that have been published in your area, and then look to see which journals published those. In dimensions, they'll have roughly 10 that you'll notice just in the left-hand column, but you can also go into the analytical views to see the whole list. We'll go ahead and, so clicking that little arrow opens up the analytical views, and then you can select the source titles and see all of the journals publishing in this area. If looking at the journal titles, you're not seeing that they really seem to be a good fit for your audience, you can focus the search more. You can go into the research categories and select a more specific category. Here I selected the agriculture, veterinary, and food science category to narrow the search, and then look at the journals again. So this can be an iterative process. You can continue tweaking the research category until you find a good fit. And then once you've got a few journal titles in mind that appear to publish study protocols on topics similar to yours, you'll want to look at the journal website for more information. You'll want to verify that they do publish this type of article and see if they have any special requirements, like reporting guidelines you need to follow, word limits, that sort of thing. So in this example, we're looking at PLOS One. They say they do publish study protocols, but they must be submitted before recruitment of participants or collection of data is complete. And they require the SPIRIT reporting checklist if the protocol was for a clinical trial. And they provide a sample template for study protocols for other study types. They list a number of items that need to be covered. And rather than go through all of this now, we can come back to this during the Q&A if there's an interest and we want to look at this more closely. This is the SPIRIT standard that PLOS One mentioned. SPIRIT stands for Standard Protocol Items, Recommendation for Interventional Trials. And if you're interested in publishing a study protocol for a clinical trial, this is the commonly recommended reporting standard across numerous journals. So publishing a study protocol is beneficial, but I do want to point out one potential issue that can arise when you then go on to publish the completed study findings. Some of what you wrote for the study protocol is also going to be covered in the research article, and it can be tempting to just copy and paste the relevant text from the protocol into the results paper, but that can be viewed as self-plagiarism. This occurs whenever an author has the same text appearing in more than one of their articles. When you've published a study protocol previously, I suggest rephrasing things instead of reusing the original text wherever possible. And be sure that you cite the previous publication. In the case of a study protocol and a results paper on that study, obviously the study methods are the same. So it can be tricky to avoid text recycling. You need to be aware. And what I actually do is I look back at the previous article, comparing it with the one that I'm writing, and make sure that there's not, I'm not just duplicating what I've already written. That said, the protocol paper typically presents the methods in very great detail, and then the results paper presents a condensed version of that. So now that you're aware of the potential issue, you should be able to navigate it just fine. The Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE, has some best practice guidelines that I have linked here. And again, this is something we can look at more closely in the Q&A if it's an area of interest. Another type of article you may find useful is a literature review. You've likely performed reviews of the literature as part of the background information for grant proposals. And certainly if you did a traditional PhD dissertation, you had a whole chapter where you provided an overview and synthesis of the existing research on the topic you're studying. These may be developed into published articles, typically as narrative reviews. Publishing a review article can be particularly helpful when you're planning to move into a research area that is new to you. Conducting the review helps you get a thorough understanding of the evidence base and immerse yourself in the literature of the new field. And if you're seeking funding but lack a proven track record in a field, having at least published a review article can demonstrate to grant reviewers that you're well versed in the literature of the field that you are trying to move into. Review articles, as opposed to study protocols, are published by many journals, but not all. Some journals only publish reviews that they have invited authors to submit. So again, you're going to want to check the journal that you have in mind and see what their policy is and what kind of requirements they have. So here again is an example from Livestock Science here about review articles, which they do, they will consider. And here the page limit is 12 journal pages. One type of literature review is the systematic review, which may also include a meta-analysis. So this is a very rigorous form of review, and it's typically conducted by a team of people, and it is often occurring over like 12 to 18 months. The recognized reporting standard for that type of review is PRISMA. And in this example from the Journal of Dairy Science, you can see for a review published here, they require submission of the PRISMA checklist along with the review articles that are submitted to them for publication. More information on PRISMA is available at the Equator Network, again, link provided. And the Equator Network links to a newer version of the guideline than the link that Journal of Dairy Science provided. And I will say the Equator Network is an excellent resource whenever you're looking for reporting standards for any type of article that you're considering publishing. It kind of bills itself as a one-stop shop for reporting standards. And last I looked, I think they were up to 600 reporting guidelines that they provide information on. And no matter what type of article you're considering writing, I always recommend find the reporting standard for that study design. And even if the journal isn't requiring you to use a reporting standard, it's just really useful for your own purposes. You can kind of go through the checklist and make sure that you're covering all of the items that are required to describe the study in enough detail that your readers have a good idea of what you actually did and whether there are any potential sources of bias that they see, and if so, how you addressed those problems, which helps them decide whether or not they trust the results that you presented. One last type of dissemination I want to touch on briefly is data sharing. This involves making available the data set that's required to replicate all of the findings you reported. It promotes transparency, and it's required by some funders, as I mentioned in our last session. Some journals also have data sharing policies, and here's an example from PLOS One, talking about their policy regarding data availability. And they do require authors to make all data necessary to replicate their study findings publicly available without restriction at the time of publication. So in many cases, this is going to require you making the data available in a data repository. And PLOS One here actually suggests some repositories that they work with. I've included it here because it's a useful list if you're looking for a repository, even if it's not for an article that you're planning to publish in PLOS. These are some of the usual suspects that you may find useful. Another resource that might be helpful in locating an appropriate repository is the Registry of Research Data Repositories. And you can browse this resource by country in the map view. And then they also have the text view. And here I've highlighted a few countries that I thought might be of interest. So you can get a sense of whether this resource will be useful to you. The database is also browsable by subject, as I've shown in this example. Here, looking at agriculture, forestry, and horticulture and veterinary medicine, and then the narrower subjects falling under that heading. NIH also has a useful list of characteristics to look for if you need to find a data repository. And this, I also included this in our previous session. And basically they're telling you to that desirable characteristics are that they provide persistent identifiers to the data set. There's a plan for the long-term sustainability of the data. There's free and easy access. They have security and data integrity measures in place, documented capabilities for ensuring confidentiality. They use a common data format that allows the data to be downloaded, accessed, or exported and used widely, and they provide documentation on their policies for data retention within the repository itself. So in this session, we talked about the importance of disseminating your findings. I presented some methods of doing so and discussed some additional types of publications that you might not have considered that go beyond just publishing original research articles. In addition to like links throughout the presentation, I've also included this final resources slide with links to relevant resources. And now I will hand it back to Nargiza.
Thank you very much, Terry. This was very interesting. I learned quite a bit of information on where else I can publish my research results outside of the peer-reviewed and peer-reviewed journals and scientific conferences. I do not see any questions, and maybe I can open up the discussion, and I invite everybody to unmute and ask the question or make a comment. With the question of the following content. In the development area where Livestock Lab is involved, there is also a lot of push to bring evidence, scientific evidence, to policymakers, and there are different avenues to disseminate scientific results through policy briefs, technical notes, white papers, and so on. Have you seen the push towards using other non-traditional ways of getting the evidence to practitioners and especially policymakers?
That's an area, so my area of expertise is more with the clinical research.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have as much experience. So for example, I've published original research articles. I've published a study protocol in the past. I've published literature reviews. So those are the things I'm most familiar with. I have not personally published white papers, but I do know that, and I don't think there's a push in my area. I think the things I discussed are more the standard in that area, but I know in other fields, white papers are a common method of dissemination. And I had a thought that just left me. I forget what, I'm not sure if it was about, I'm not sure if this was it, but here's a new train of thought. As far as clinical research and reaching clinicians, sometimes that is where carefully choosing the journal that you're publishing in comes into play, checking the audience. So while we're not talking clinical research here, I think that might also be a useful tactic in other fields if you have a particular audience in mind. There may be scholarly journals that are reaching that audience, and that can be worth pursuing, especially we kind of come back to that if publish or perish is a reality in your world. Scholarly journal articles typically are more frequently cited, and those citations are typically tracked better. So it's easier to show the impact by just stating a citation count. Whereas I know for some types of papers, if they're not in recognized indexes where people are finding them and then citing them, you may have to, if you're trying to document the impact of your work, sometimes you have to find ways of, if you can find like the number of times that paper was viewed or downloaded, and that can be a more difficult metric to track down. So that is something I would consider if you're publishing white papers and that's an accepted outlet in your field, look into how you can best document the fact that that paper is having impact in the field.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Terry. You brought up some important considerations. One, of course, it depends on the discipline.
Yes.
Second, it depends on the area of work you're doing and the audiences you're trying to reach. And certainly, tracking a research paper published in a peer-reviewed journal or presented at a scientific conference is easier than tracking down different knowledge products you can produce out of your research results, including policy briefs, white papers, and so on.
Yeah, and that just, so I remembered where what else I wanted to say about that is the other side of that, where it is it can be harder for other researchers to find white papers. There's sometimes, by librarians, there's sometimes referred to as gray literature because they're not showing up in like the standard indexes and databases and things. So for that reason, if you're wanting to reach the largest audience, if you're wanting your work to be seen by the most people, just know that a white paper might not be the best option for that. But again, that's going to be very much discipline specific.
Yes, and if I may add, the white papers that I have seen were written more in non-scientific ways to make the information more accessible and understandable by ordinary people who may not specialize or do science in your areas, who will understand the scientific terms and the way you present the data. So that's one of the other features that distinguishes, and you may have to consider if you decide to bring your work outside of the traditional research areas of disseminating. I have, there is a comment from our country coordinator in Rwanda, Felix and Jami, and I will read this, Terry. It's a little bit long. And I'm happy to repeat the question later. So the question reads, dissemination is a good part of the research. However, it is rarely considered during planning studies. It has never been mandatory to disseminate the work. How could this be pushed into research and make sure end users access the materials / findings for consumption? So this is question one. Second, is it possible to share same websites that have free access repository?
So this may just be a difference in fields, but in my experience, it's extremely common for the expectation that research findings are going to be published. And I would say even if it's not kind of the standard in your discipline, I think the reasons that I gave for why it's important still apply. I'm not sure how the research has a large impact if it's not being shared with others, whether that's through journal publications or presentations at conferences or in white papers. Somehow or other, the word needs to get out about, if it's happening in a vacuum, I'm at a loss for how it's benefiting the larger community.
Yeah.
And
Terry,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, please.
No, go ahead.
No, I think what the way I understood this, and it's probably because Felix and I are engaged in research for development area. There is a big push by the donors that are funding research for development projects to even present a dissemination plan where you will disseminate your research results not only to your peers in the scientific peers in your area of research, but also to the wider audience. So they really ask you, how are you going to take your results?
Okay.
Are you presenting at the conference? Are you presenting
Yes.
peer reviewed? Are you talking to your to the policymakers? Are you talking to, for example, in the livestock space, to livestock producers, farmers, the service providers, and so on? So I think this is what Felix may have meant. How could the dissemination plan to wider audience be integrated into the planning process of the research activity? So you take your results outside of the scientific community.
Okay.
It's sort of preaching outside of your
right. Yes. Yeah. And
mm-hmm.
I don't think I have a good answer for that. There's a resource that I've heard of, but I haven't used myself. I'm not sure how effective it is. But it's called Kudos. It's KUDOS. And I think the website is kudos.com. And it's the what they do is it's a tool that you can use to put present the research that you've done in what we call layman's terms. So, instead of the academic terminology that we're all familiar with, putting it in like plain language that anyone can understand. So that would be something, if that's something I was trying to do, that is one resource I would take a closer look at. And sometimes more and more, I'm finding that things that are presented like in the scientific community are getting disseminated to the broader community through things like social media posts. And lots of times, like when you're now you go to a conference, and typically the conference itself, like during the conference, they're tweeting like sending out social media posts about things that are going on at the conference. And those reach everybody, not just the scientific community. So even though you're presenting just to like your audience, the conferences themselves are making a point of broadly disseminating that information so that the general public can pick up on it. And if
Okay, thank you, Terry.
if you're interested in seeing the kind of different means of disseminating, there's a tool called Altmetric that you can access. It's altmetric.com, I believe, which they have. You can look up different research outputs and see what kind of, whether there's been talked about in the in like traditional news sources, social media sources. So you can follow up on any of those types of metrics and see how things are spreading beyond the academy.
Thank you, Terry. We are coming very close to ending this webinar. It's already 58 minutes. And before we go, Terry, if you could post those two websites that you mentioned, kudos.com and then the last one in the chat, that would be much appreciated while I am, you can take me to the next slide. So I could remind about our last webinar in the series, webinar 6, which will be around sharing strategies for increasing writing productivity. And in that webinar, we will introduce the concept of writing accountability groups and other strategies to support you in disseminating your work. That webinar will be on December 15th at the same time, and it will be the same link requiring you to register before accessing the webinar. We hope that we will have all the webinar recordings in this series and associated slides in English and French available very soon. And when it happens, we will disseminate those with you widely so you can review some of the webinars that you missed and as well as share those with your colleagues and students. We are at the 1 hour, but there is a question, Terry, if you wouldn't mind taking that. And
Sure.
it's from a colleague in Rwanda, Dr. Irimaso. His question reads, sometime field study students workshops are interesting and gather some good information. Is there a platform for publishing such work?
I am not aware of any in particular that that I can recommend. I do know some people will post like slide decks and things in either if they have an institutional repository, they will often post those types of materials there. I think, I'm not sure of this, but I think GitHub, which was one of the resources on the plus one slide, GitHub, I think that possibly GitHub or Zenodo might be useful places where you could upload slides as well. But as far as like a particular, this is the go-to place for slide decks, I'm unaware of one that I could recommend.
Thank you, Terry. I would like to invite Emmanuel to unmute and maybe shares his experience of using this way of sharing, publishing some of the work that he has done here with his students.
Thank you, Nargiza, for the floor. I haven't published that. That's why I was asking there if they have been conducting some training with the student and workshops around the interface of human livestock and wildlife. And we interacted the community and we gather some information, which we present in poster. Sometimes we get some dissemination in the school and the university, but having those posters like every year, I think I was looking for maybe if there's a platform that can maybe gather all the posters and all those findings we get to publish a book, I don't know, paper or something else so they can be accessible to other students across the world. Thank you.
Terry, can you take this last comment?
Yeah, as I say, unfortunately, I'm not aware of any resource that is, that doesn't mean there isn't something out there. I'm just not familiar with any that do that. As I say, typically with my experience, those types of things are happening at conferences, and the conferences are making those things available. So I've never actually had to seek out like an outside source to share that material. I can do a bit of a search, see if I come across anything, and if I do, I can forward the links to you, Nargiza, and you could then share it with the larger group.
That's a good idea. Thank you, Terry. And thank you for all the participants who joined us in webinar 5. Unfortunately, we will have to stop here because we are a little over an hour. Please come on December 15th for the last webinar in the series, where we will talk about strategies to increase your productivity to publish your research results. For now, bye and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.